The Keaton farm stood at the farthest edge of Cedar Grove, Wisconsin, where the road bent into marshland and the trees grew so tightly that daylight seemed reluctant to pass through. In 1878, the house was the picture of modest American labor. A white-painted farmhouse with red shutters, a barn that leaned slightly from years of storms, and fields that yielded just enough to keep the family afloat. To passing neighbors, the Keatons were the image of devotion. The father, Elias, was stern but dutiful, a man who bowed his head in church and tilled the soil with diligence. Clara, his wife, was pale but polite, always with a loaf of bread or a jar of preserves to offer visitors. Their children were seen less often, usually clinging close to their mother's skirts or peering shyly from the upstairs window. From the dirt road, nothing seemed unusual. Yet within the walls, something different ruled, something that had little to do with soil, crop, or prayer. What neighbors could not see was how Elias insisted the house itself breathed like a living body. He sealed cracks with pitch, nailed heavy curtains over the windows, and kept every door locked from the inside. He called it protection, saying the world outside carried diseases and temptations that could weaken a child before they even reached their 9th year. Inside, every clock was wound at the same hour, every meal portioned in exact weights, every bed measured for straightness of sheets. Order was not discipline, it was doctrine, and doctrine had no space for tenderness. When a child cried at night, the sound was noted in a ledger. When one coughed, the cough was counted. And when silence lasted too long, Elias took it as proof of improvement. Clara's hands shook as she carried out her husband's rules, but she never disobeyed. To her, Elias's rituals were both punishment and protection. She washed the children's faces until their skin peeled raw, insisting it cleansed them of unseen filth. She boiled their milk with herbs that left it bitter, whispering that bitterness was strength. On Sundays, she forced them to kneel for hours in the parlor until their knees split, saying the pain was holy. When neighbors asked about the children's pale complexions, Clara explained softly that they were weak in the lungs, prone to faintness. She smiled as she said it, and no one pressed her further. What the townsfolk didn't notice were the strange carvings on the Keaton porch posts, faint lines etched like tally marks, always grouped in sevens. No one thought to ask why Elias often scraped soot from the stove and carried it down to the root cellar in jars. And no one questioned why the children rarely played outside, except when Elias lined them up along the fence and inspected them like livestock, checking teeth, nails, and eyes with an expression that seemed less like a father's concern and more like a farmer judging the ripeness of fruit. In the evenings, the family's lamp burned long after others had gone dark. Inside, Elias demanded the children sit in silence as he read aloud from books that were neither Bible nor hymn. They were notebooks of his own making, filled with numbers, diagrams, and strange passages about growth and sacrifice. He would point to their faces and tell them that bodies were only vessels, and vessels could be perfected through discipline, through subtraction, through surrender. Clara nodded along, her face pale and hollow, her hands tightening on her lap. The children stared ahead, their eyes dulled by rules they could not break. The townspeople pitied the Keatons for their isolation but saw no reason to intervene. Families often carried private sorrows, illness, misfortune, hard tempers. These were considered part of rural life. But if anyone had stepped closer, if anyone had pushed through the locked doors or descended into the root cellar, they would have found not sorrow but design. The cellar walls bore chalk drawings of small bodies sketched in faint outlines with notations beside them about weight and bone. Beneath the staircase was a box of tiny shoes, some scorched, others stitched together with thread as if to bind one to another. The house was not merely a home. It was a vessel for a mind that believed love was too weak to protect children, that only ritual and order could. By the summer of 1878, whispers began that the Keatons' youngest daughter, Elsie, had not been seen in weeks. Clara explained she was bedridden with fever, too weak to come outside. Neighbors accepted this, though some noticed the curtains in Elsie's upstairs room had been drawn for months. The window never opened, the air inside surely stale. Yet no one asked questions because the Keatons still walked to church on Sundays, still bowed their heads, still held hands as they sang hymns. They were not outcasts. They were not mad. They were a family, and families suffered in silence. The house on Cedar Grove remained a landmark of stability in the town's eye, even as its walls absorbed the cries of children no one else would hear. To passers-by, it was painted white, sturdy, unremarkable. To those inside, it was a sealed chamber where innocence was measured, tested, and consumed. And though no one yet knew it, the house had already begun its quiet harvest. On by autumn, the Keaton family appeared unchanged to the casual eye, but the number of children had quietly lessened. They were once 6, but now they were 5. No funeral bell had been rung, no fresh earth had been turned in the churchyard. Instead, a whispered explanation passed from one neighbor to the next, carried in careful tones. The Keaton's second youngest had died suddenly, Elias claimed, taken by an illness that struck fast and left no trace. Clara spoke of a fever that burned through the night and extinguished life by dawn. She said this with a distant calm, as if repeating a script given to her. When asked about the burial, she only nodded toward the woods and murmured that Elias handled everything. The town doctor, a man who kept sparse notes and drank more than he wrote, had no record of attending to the child. When pressed, he muttered that he remembered hearing of the sickness, but never entered the house to confirm it. The ledger he kept for deaths that season bore no Keaton name, and yet the neighbors accepted the story. Illness claimed many children in those years, and families often chose to bury their own quietly. But a seed of unease was planted, small but undeniable. Inside the Keaton home, absence was both obvious and forbidden to mention. Clara moved through her duties with mechanical precision, setting 5 bowls instead of 6, folding 5 sets of clothes instead of 6. She never stumbled in her count, as if her body had rehearsed the adjustment long before. The children did not ask about their missing sibling. Their faces were pale, their eyes lowered, as if some rule bound their tongues as firmly as locks bound the cellar doors. Elias, meanwhile, continued his rituals. He weighed each child's portion of bread with a scale, logging the exact ounces consumed. He paced the rooms at night, whispering numbers as though marking progress. And every 7th day he made the children kneel in silence before the hearth, their heads bowed while he recited his notes instead of scripture. It was in this season that the neighbors began to notice Clara's hands were raw and bandaged, the skin stripped from constant scrubbing. They began to notice Elias's strange insistence on sealing the windows, even as frost formed on the glass. When one neighbor asked after the missing child, Elias's face grew still. He said only, "Some vessels are too weak to carry the spirit." The words chilled even the most pious listener, but they dared not question him further. To accuse a father of harm without proof was to risk exile from the community itself. What they did not see was how Elias framed the child's death within his own design. In his journals hidden in a locked drawer, he wrote that the boy had failed the 9th-year trial, that the vessel collapsed before reaching perfection. He described the body as too fragile, the bones too porous, the will too soft. He wrote that the error was not God's but his own, that his measurements had been imprecise, that he must refine his methods. The death was not an end, but an experiment. Clara, though silent, seemed complicit in her own way. She stitched a small garment with the initials of the lost child and placed it beneath the cradle in the attic, as if keeping a relic. When she washed linens at the creek, neighbors swore she sometimes spoke to the water, asking it to carry whispers to the child she could not name aloud. Yet even her grief seemed shaped by ritual, contained within Elias's system of silence and control. The Keaton children still appeared in church, their numbers fewer but their behavior unchanged. They sang the hymns without falter, their voices thin but steady. No one asked why they never smiled. No one asked why their shoes always seemed damp, as if they had walked through water before arriving. The absence of one child was folded neatly into the fabric of rural life, just another misfortune to be endured. But the truth lingered behind shuttered windows and locked cellar doors. A family once 8 was now 7, and what the neighbors accepted as illness was in fact something else. Something measured, recorded, and repeated. The town did not yet understand that what was gone was not only a child, but the first proof that the Keaton home was not ruled by chance but by design. Among the few possessions left behind after the Keatons' decline was a journal bound in brown leather, its spine cracked, its pages brittle with age. It was Clara's handwriting, neat at first, the loops graceful, the ink steady. Yet as the entries continued, the lines grew darker, heavier, as if her hand pressed harder with each word. What began as the reflections of a mother became something else, a ledger of devotion that throbbed with menace beneath its calm surface. She began by describing the children's ailments. Night fevers, sudden fits, long stretches where they would sit in silence, staring at the wall as though their thoughts had fled. Clara noted the exact hours each child shivered, the color of their tongues, the strange smell of their sweat. She wrote of forgetting, not hers but theirs. One child who woke unable to remember his own name. Another who asked who his mother was. Clara did not record fear. She wrote instead that these moments were gifts, signs of purification, proof that memory itself could be burned away like disease. She seemed almost pleased that her children forgot themselves before the end, as though innocence was sharpened by erasure. In the margins, Clara recorded symbols. Small carvings made into wood around the house. Crosses with their arms bent, circles intersected by straight lines, shapes resembling tally marks grouped in 7s. She claimed Elias cut them into the bedposts and the cellar beams, saying they anchored the family against corruption. Clara described running her fingers over them each morning, believing they had grown deeper overnight. Sometimes she found splinters beneath her nails as though the wood itself resisted being marked. To her, the symbols were holy. To anyone else, they would have looked like a language of command. Not prayers, but instructions. The tone of her writing never drifted into hysteria. She spoke with quiet conviction, her voice patient, almost gentle. She called the children vessels more often than by name, remarking that their weakness was both curse and blessing. She wrote that the younger ones must not be allowed to reach 9 years without being tested, that the 9th year was when flesh either hardened or collapsed. She praised Elias for his measurements, though she never explained what those entailed. Her words implied loyalty, not love. It was the loyalty of a scribe recording rituals she did not invent, but obeyed. The most unsettling passages described her role in tending to the children during their final nights. She wrote that she cooled their fevers not with water but with ash pressed onto their foreheads. She said she fed them milk steeped in roots that caused their tongues to grow heavy, their eyes to blur, their bodies to weaken. She admitted she sometimes held them tightly as their chests rose and fell more slowly, whispering that they were almost free. Yet she did not speak of death as an ending. She wrote as though the children were being remade, their remains set aside like harvest kept for later use. At times, Clara's words revealed flickers of grief, but even grief was reshaped by ritual. She wrote of waking in the night to hear phantom cries in the attic, of finding small handprints in the soot near the hearth. Instead of questioning these signs, she called them visitations, proof that the children lingered nearby, loyal even after their bodies failed. She believed they remained bound to the family, not lost, not gone, only waiting. The journal closed with lists, names of the children, some crossed out, others circled, dates of their sicknesses, weights of their bodies, small jars labeled with initials. The details were methodical, as if Clara wished to leave behind not memory but record. And though her voice never strayed from devotion, it dripped with coldness. She described each child's final days as though describing weather, precise, detached, inevitable. The words offered no comfort, no mother's tenderness, only the steady hand of someone who believed suffering was sacred, and that to endure it without resistance was the highest form of obedience. When read aloud years later, the journal unsettled even hardened investigators. It was not a confession, nor an accusation, but something worse. A calm witness to cruelty disguised as care. Clara Keaton had written not to mourn, but to prove that each child's end was part of a plan she never questioned, a plan she may have believed was holy. And through those pages, the silence of the Keaton home finally found a voice, though one colder than death itself. It was the spring thaw when the first whispers began. Snow had melted into thick rivulets that carved paths through the fields, carrying with them the smell of damp soil and rotting leaves. 4-year-old Elsie Keaton was last seen on the edge of the farm, her small figure wrapped in a faded shawl, staring toward the creek that bordered the property. Neighbors remembered her golden hair, the only brightness among the pale, silent brood. Days later, she was gone. The family said little at first. When asked, Elias explained that Elsie had wandered too near the water and been swept away. Clara repeated the story in her soft, mechanical voice, adding that the girl had been feverish and confused. It was tragedy, they said, nothing more, yet no one in Cedar Grove could recall a funeral nor the toll of the bell that usually marked the passing of a child. No procession, no fresh mound in the churchyard. Instead, silence. The absence of ritual where ritual was expected made the neighbors uneasy. They asked again about Elsie's body, and Elias's answer never changed. The creek had taken her. His tone was final, as though the matter was no longer theirs to speak of. But then came the shoes. 4 days after her disappearance, a farmer downstream found them caught against a tangle of roots in the shallows. Small, worn, knotted together at the laces with rough twine. Shoes do not bind themselves. The detail spread through town like smoke. Mothers clutched their children closer, whispering that perhaps Elsie had been tied to prevent her wandering. Others murmured darker things, though none spoke too loudly within earshot of Elias. He was a man who stood tall in the pews, a man who worked the soil with visible strength. To accuse him of cruelty without proof was unthinkable, even if unease gnawed at everyone who heard about the twine. What made the discovery worse was Clara's reaction. When the shoes were returned to her, she did not weep or collapse. She simply placed them on the mantel above the hearth and left them there untouched. Visitors said she stared at them during meals, her lips moving silently as though reciting a prayer. The children avoided the mantel, their eyes flickering toward the shoes but never lingering. In time, the shoes gathered dust as if Elsie's presence had been deliberately preserved but not mourned. Behind the Keatons' walls, Elsie's absence became another adjustment, seamless and silent. 5 bowls set instead of 6, 5 bodies lined against the fence for inspection. Clara scrubbed the floors until her hands bled, saying only that the house must remain clean for the others. Elias kept his ledgers, his notes growing thicker, his eyes sharper when he measured the remaining children's weight or tested their endurance. Elsie's name was never spoken aloud again except in Clara's journal, where a single entry appeared. Vessel failed in the 4th year. Return to the current. Neighbors, unsettled, tried to convince themselves of the drowning. Children wandered and were lost all the time. The creek had swollen with meltwater, deep and swift in places. It was not impossible, yet the shoes lingered in their thoughts. Why bound together? Why tied with twine rough enough to cut into the leather? And if Elsie had drowned, why had her body not surfaced, as most do, swollen and pale? Rumors began to stretch further. Some said Elias buried her on the property. Others whispered about the cellar, about the soot jars he carried there. But no one asked too closely. In rural towns, silence was protection and few were willing to break it. For the Keaton children, the loss was felt in ways no one outside could measure. At night, some were heard whimpering in their sleep. By day, they grew quieter still, their shoulders hunched, their eyes glazed as if retreating from the world. When asked by neighbors if they missed Elsie, they lowered their heads and said nothing, as though a rule forbade the words. It was as if they too had been bound not with twine, but with fear. By summer, Elsie was a ghostly memory. The shoes remained above the hearth, untouched, a reminder to all who entered that the house kept its own rituals, rituals that did not match the customs of the town. While other families buried and prayed, the Keatons preserved and recorded. To them, loss was not tragedy, but design. Elsie's vanishing marked the first visible crack in their facade, though the town was not yet ready to face what it meant. The child was gone, and in her place stood a silence that seemed heavier than grief. A silence that bound itself to the house like the twine that once held her shoes. It was long after the Keaton farm had fallen into ruin that the cellar revealed what the family had worked so hard to keep hidden. By the early 1900s, the house stood empty, its shutters broken, its roof sagging inward. When new owners attempted to renovate the property, they descended into the cellar with lanterns and crowbars, hoping only to clear away rot. What they unearthed instead were relics of a mind that had shaped suffering with precision. In a corner beneath the stairwell lay a collection of rusted instruments, carefully arranged on a warped wooden table. At first glance, they resembled tools for farming or perhaps crude medical devices, but closer inspection showed they were something else entirely. Handles worn smooth from long use. Iron prongs bent and filed into hooks. Clamps altered with screws that tightened not quickly but slowly, turning by fractions of an inch. These were not instruments of healing nor of harvest. They were designed for control, to hold a body in place, to delay its collapse while silence consumed it. One device resembled a cradle, but its frame was iron rather than wood, its curved bars lined with small teeth angled inward. It could not comfort or rock a child to sleep. It was meant to contain, to keep its occupant from shifting even as their flesh pressed against the points. Another was a chair with holes drilled into the seat, beneath which rusted pans were set, as if to collect what dripped from above. The wood was stained darker than time alone could account for. The most unsettling was a set of masks, hammered from tin, each with narrow slits for breathing but no space for voice. Straps of leather rotted beside them, stiff with age. They bore no resemblance to the protective masks used in medicine or industry. These were fashioned to silence, to force the wearer into suffocation's edge, their own shallow breaths echoing back into their skull. The design spoke of patience, of someone who did not wish for quick death but for prolonged obedience, a body reduced to a vessel of endurance. Neighbors who later heard of the discovery whispered that Elias had built them himself, altering farm implements with an intelligence both meticulous and grotesque. His journals, never found in full, hinted at measurements, trials, failures. Each device seemed built for that same purpose, to test how long a body could be stretched between pain and silence, how far a vessel could be driven before breaking. Mercy had no place in their making. They were tools of stillness, designed for hours, perhaps days, where breath faltered but never fully ceased. For the workers clearing the cellar, the instruments were more than relics. They were proof that the Keaton household had been ruled by something darker than strict discipline or illness. The children's deaths had not been accidents of fever or drowning. They had been shaped, controlled, timed. These devices bore the mark of intent, of ritual carried out with a craftsman's patience. They were not crude. They were perfected. When word of the discovery spread, officials debated whether to catalog or destroy them. Some wanted them preserved as evidence. Others insisted they carried a corruption too deep to risk keeping. In the end, many of the instruments were buried in a pit behind the barn, covered in lime, as if the town itself wanted to erase the memory. But silence cannot erase design. Those who saw them never forgot the image of the cradle with its iron teeth, or the masks that allowed only breath but no voice. The cellar's secret confirmed what whispers had long suggested. The Keaton home had been more than a place of family life. It was a chamber where childhood was tested against instruments built not for nurturing but for dismantling. Each rusted piece told the same story, that the children had not merely vanished but had been pressed into experiments of endurance, their silence shaped by tools designed to prolong suffering until the vessel gave way. In the years before the Keaton family's silence became legend, a handful of relatives passed briefly through the farmhouse. Most did not linger long. The house seemed to swallow visitors, its rooms cold even in summer, its shutters always drawn against the light. Yet one memory endured in those who stayed overnight, the sound of a cradle rocking in the dark. The cradle sat in the upstairs room where the youngest children slept. It was an old piece carved from oak, its edges smooth from generations of use. When the cousins first arrived, they assumed the cradle would be for the baby Margaret, but by then Margaret no longer slept in it. She lay in a narrow bed against the wall, while the cradle stood empty at the foot of the room. Even so, it moved. At night, when the house fell silent, the cousins swore they heard the cradle creak as though stirred by a gentle hand. The sound carried down the stairwell, rhythmic and patient, a lullaby without a song. One girl who stayed during the spring of 1881 remembered pressing her ear to the floorboards above the parlor, listening to the steady groan of wood against wood. She described it years later with trembling clarity, the sound of a child soothed where no child lay. In the mornings, the cradle appeared untouched, its mattress neat, its coverlet folded. Yet when the cousins dared to lift it, they found the faint impression of weight in the straw, as if something small had pressed there during the night. The truth of the cradle was stranger still. Beneath the mattress, stitched into the lining, were threads of pale hair and fine black ash, gathered deliberately, pressed flat. No cousin dared to ask Clara why such things had been hidden there. Some believed the hair belonged to Elsie, the daughter who had vanished into the creek and never returned. Others whispered that the ash was not from hearth fires but from something Elias burned in secret jars. Whatever the origin, its presence suggested the cradle was not meant for comfort at all, but for preservation, a shrine disguised as furniture. Clara spoke of the cradle often, though never to explain it. She called it the vessel of beginnings, a place where memory could return to rest. Sometimes she sat beside it in the afternoons, rocking it with her foot while humming tunelessly, her eyes distant. The surviving children avoided the cradle, stepping wide around it as though it carried heat. Yet when Elias entered the room, he inspected it carefully, running his hand along the rails as though checking for cracks, then recording something in his pocket notebook before moving on. The cousins, unsettled, left with stories they could not forget. They told neighbors that the Keatons kept a cradle that rocked without cause, a cradle that seemed to cradle absence itself. The townsfolk laughed nervously, saying children imagined things. But the details never wavered. More than one cousin described the sound of the cradle moving though no one touched it. More than one cousin described Clara gathering hair from the children's combs and slipping it beneath the mattress at night. In time, when investigators searched the house after its abandonment, the cradle was still there. By then the wood had warped, the rails loose, but beneath its straw they found the remnants just as the cousins had described. Threads of blonde and brown hair tangled together. Ash pressed into the fabric like fine dust clinging to the seams. It was not proof of death, not evidence a court could use, but it was a signature of the Keaton household. The transformation of ordinary objects into instruments of ritual. The cradle that once should have soothed a child to sleep had instead been remade into something else entirely. It did not hold infants. It held remnants. It did not sing lullabies. It whispered silence. And in its steady creak during the midnight hours, the visiting cousins had unknowingly listened to the rhythm of the Keaton home itself. A rhythm not of life, but of absence made sacred, of memory transformed into something colder than mourning. By the time the Keaton story began to seep into rumor, a grim pattern had already been carved into their family history. Each of their children, save for the youngest, seemed to vanish before the age of 9, not in sudden accidents or outbreaks that swept through the town, but quietly, one by one, their absence explained with a softness that masked something far darker. Elias spoke of fevers that would not break, of lungs too weak for country air, of fainting spells that carried children into the grave. Clara echoed his words with calm resignation, as if repeating a truth written long before. Yet whenever fragments of their remains surfaced, they told another story entirely. The first to be found was the partial body of Thomas, the eldest son, uncovered when workers dug near the creek bed years later. His bones had been marked, not with the scratches of stones or animal teeth, but with deliberate etchings that resembled lines cut into soil before planting. Straight grooves, spaced evenly like crop markings laid upon his skin. His teeth, though milk teeth in part, bore strange filing, sharp, triangular, as though shaped into points by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. The remains were too degraded for certainty, but the impression was undeniable. Thomas had not simply died. He had been altered. When neighbors confronted Elias about the rumors, he dismissed them coldly. He said nature leaves marks of its own, that water carves bones, that soil stains flesh. As for the teeth, he claimed children sometimes grind their jaws until they crack. He called it misfortune, nothing more. But those who had seen the bones could not forget what they resembled. Not nature's accidents, but symbols, experiments, trials repeated again and again. Patterns continued with the others. Elsie's body was never recovered, but her shoes, tied with twine, bore the same sense of intention. Samuel, whose tooth was later found wedged into the rafters of the barn, had been last seen with split lips, as if his mouth had been pried open. Margaret, the youngest, was discovered laid out in the parlor, her eyelids sewn shut, her skin powdered white. These were not scenes of illness. They were tableaux, arranged with purpose, shaped by hands that saw children not as sons and daughters, but as vessels to be tested. The townsfolk struggled to understand. In those years, superstition and faith often blurred, and some wondered if Elias believed himself a keeper of ritual older than Scripture. His journals, when fragments were found decades later, spoke of trials before the 9th year, of flesh that must either harden or break. He measured weight, height, endurance, and obedience as though raising crops rather than children. The etched lines on the bones resembled the furrows he cut into his fields, controlled, ordered, measured. To Elias, the body was soil, and the child a seed to be pressed, marked, and cultivated. Clara's role was more silent but no less chilling. In her journal, she called the markings gifts of refinement, writing that her children forgot themselves before they passed, as though identity itself was shed like a husk. She wrote of sharpening milk teeth so that the vessel would return with strength. She wrote of carving lines to anchor spirit to bone. These were not the words of a grieving mother. They were the words of a witness who saw cruelty as transformation, who accepted Elias's vision as holy duty. By now, the neighbors no longer believed in illness. They noticed that the Keaton children rarely played, rarely laughed, rarely aged past a certain point. They noticed that the family pew in church grew smaller each year, yet no one intervened. The pattern was visible, but in a town where privacy was sacred, where interference could destroy fragile community bonds, silence endured. And in that silence, Elias continued. When the instruments in the cellar were uncovered decades later, they confirmed what the remains had already suggested. The clamps, the masks, the iron cradle, each was designed not to kill outright, but to extend the process, to hold the vessel steady while the body was etched, altered, refined. Elias did not seek swiftness, he sought endurance. Silence stretched across hours until the vessel gave way. His logic was never recorded in full, but his actions made his purpose clear. He believed in shaping flesh to prove spirit, in pressing children into designs only he could see. The horror lay not only in the cruelty, but in the order behind it. These were not fits of rage or moments of madness. They were deliberate, repeated, patterned. Each child met the same fate near the same age, each altered in ways that suggested a system, a doctrine carried out with a farmer's patience and a craftsman's hand. Elias had transformed parenthood into experiment, turning the cycle of life into a cycle of trials. The Keaton house, with its shuttered windows and sealed cellar, stood as the perfect stage for his design. Outwardly, the family remained pious, devoted, ordinary. Inwardly, they measured, carved, filed, and preserved. And as each child vanished before the 9th year, the truth of the household deepened into something no neighbor could face aloud, that beneath the facade of farm life lay a methodical harvest of silence, one vessel at a time. It was late summer when Clara Keaton invited a neighbor, the wife of a farmer who lived half a mile down the road, to help with the churning. The woman remembered the day vividly because she had always thought Clara peculiar but never frightening until then. The Keaton kitchen smelled of boiled herbs and damp wood. The windows shuttered even though the sun was high. Clara moved with quiet urgency, her hands pale and cracked, her hair pulled so tightly back that her temples seemed stretched. She set the churn before them both, the heavy lid resting on its rim. At first, everything appeared ordinary. The milk foamed with its usual thickness. The churner's handle creaked as it turned. Yet when the neighbor lifted the lid to check, what met her eyes was not pale butter rising from cream. Instead, black streaks ran through the liquid, dark as tar, curling into shapes that spread and dissolved again. She recoiled, insisting the milk was spoiled, but Clara only shook her head. Her expression did not change, though her voice carried a strange certainty as she said, "It is purifying itself." The neighbor tried to laugh it off, but she noticed Clara's eyes fixed on the dark streaks as if they revealed something hidden, something only she could see. Clara stirred the liquid with a wooden spoon and pressed the streaks back down, whispering under her breath. The words were faint, but the neighbor swore later they did not sound like prayer. They sounded like instructions. When the churn was sealed again, Clara motioned for silence, as though the liquid itself must not be disturbed by idle talk. The neighbor returned home unsettled, determined to forget the incident. But weeks later, her healthiest cow was found dead in the field. At first it seemed a simple case of bloat, but when her husband cut open the stomach, they found it filled with stones. Smooth river rocks, dozens of them, packed so tightly inside that the animal could no longer stand. The sight horrified them. They buried the cow without speaking of it, but word spread quickly as it always did. When the woman confronted Clara about the coincidence, Clara only replied with a faint smile and said, "That's how the body learns to harden." Her words struck deeper than any denial could have. Harden against what? Against illness? Against sin? Or against weakness that Elias claimed would collapse before the 9th year? To Clara, the blackened milk and the cow's death were not accidents but lessons. She saw the world itself participating in their rituals, liquids turning foul, flesh filling with stone, bodies learning to endure or to fail. Other neighbors began to recall strange details they had once overlooked. How Clara sometimes scalded the children's milk until it curdled, forcing them to drink it anyway. Her voice calm as she said bitterness made the heart strong. How she gathered herbs no one else recognized, grinding them into powders that smelled of iron and ash. How she carried small jars into the cellar, returning with the faint odor of burning. At the time, these habits were dismissed as oddities, but when the cow's death followed the churning of blackened milk, the town began to murmur. Some suspected witchcraft, though that word was rarely spoken aloud. Others believed Clara was unwell, her mind shaped by grief, her rituals nothing more than madness disguised as order. But there were those who thought differently. They said Elias and Clara were not broken at all. They were precise. They were patient. And Clara's milk, blackened as it was part of the same system that carved lines into bone and sewed eyelids shut. It was another way to test the vessel, to poison without killing, to prepare without destroying. Years later, when investigators examined the Keaton cellar, they found jars filled with residue that bore the same tar-like sheen. The milk had not spoiled by chance. It had been tainted deliberately, perhaps with ash, perhaps with something stranger still. The jars carried traces of hair, fragments of bone, small things ground fine and mixed back into the liquid of life. To Clara, this was not contamination. It was transformation. She believed the body needed to consume its own reminders of mortality, to take death into itself so it could learn to resist it. The farmer's wife who first saw the blackened churn never forgot the image. She lived long enough to tell it again and again, her voice quivering as she recalled Clara's steady gaze and her calm words. And in her telling, the detail that haunted most was not the black milk itself, nor the stones inside her cow, but Clara's simple certainty. For in that quiet certainty lay the true horror of the Keaton home. Cruelty that did not scream, did not falter, but whispered in ordinary acts, twisting food, drink, and even nourishment into rituals of decay. Samuel Keaton was the 5th born, a boy of 8 with a frame thinner than his age should have allowed and eyes that carried the dull shine of someone already worn past endurance. Unlike his brothers and sisters, he sometimes broke the rule of silence. In the late summer of 1882, he slipped from the Keaton property and wandered down the dirt road to a neighbor's fence. There, trembling in the fading light, he asked for shelter. The neighbor's wife recalled the moment years later, her voice cracking as she described the child's cracked lips and the deep grooves around his nails, as if he had been prying at wood or stone for days. He did not ask for food, he asked only to be hidden. The story he told in whispers was one of lessons. He said his father made him plunge his hands into boiling grain, holding them there until the skin blistered and peeled, explaining that strength was measured not by muscle but by endurance. He said his nails had been torn one by one with pliers, not as punishment but as training for patience. He spoke of nights spent in the cellar mask, the tin pressing against his face until breath came only in shallow gasps. His own heart beat loud enough to drown out thought. The neighbor's wife tried to hush him, tried to assure him he was safe, but before she could press further, Clara arrived at the fence. Clara's face was expressionless as she took Samuel's arm. She told the neighbor softly that the boy was sick, feverish, prone to stories. She promised he would be tended to at home, thanked the woman for her kindness, and led him back up the road. Samuel did not resist, but he looked over his shoulder once, his lips forming words no one could hear. It was the last time anyone outside the Keaton home saw him alive. Days later, Samuel was gone. Elias explained it the way he explained all the others. The boy had weakened, fallen ill, and passed before his 9th year. There was no body for burial, no service at the church. Just another subtraction folded into the silence of the farmhouse. But this time the neighbors remembered the child's plea. They remembered the look in his eyes, the broken skin on his hands, the way he begged for protection. Whispers spread that Samuel had not died of illness but of something far worse. Something methodical that had been practiced on all the Keaton children. The truth of his disappearance was confirmed only by what was found later. When the farm fell into ruin decades afterwards, scavengers searching the barn rafters discovered a single human tooth wedged between the beams. Forensic analysis was impossible by the standards of the time, but neighbors insisted it must have been Samuel's. The tooth was too small to belong to a grown man, too permanent to have fallen from a child naturally. It looked forced out, as if ripped from the jaw and discarded in the struggle. That tooth became his only marker, his only grave. The horror of Samuel's fate lay not only in his suffering, but in his clarity. Unlike the others, he named what was happening. He gave words to the lessons, described the boiling grain, the tearing of nails, the breathless masks. His testimony, brief as it was, revealed Elias's design in its rawest form. These were not punishments in anger, but orchestrated trials, tests to harden or to break, inflicted with a cold belief that silence could be taught through pain. Samuel begged for escape not from discipline, but from ritual. The townsfolk, confronted with his words, remained paralyzed. Some dismissed his plea as feverish invention, others said it was not their place to interfere in another man's household. And so, Samuel vanished into the same silence that swallowed Elsie, Thomas, and the rest. The farm continued its rituals. The neighbors continued to look away. And all that remained of Samuel Keaton, the 5th child who dared to speak, was a tooth lodged in the rafters. A final fragment of defiance in a house that measured endurance by suffering. By 1901, the Keaton farm was a ruin. The house leaned like a tired skeleton, its shutters broken, its roof collapsed into the upper floor. Families who passed the abandoned property warned their children not to step near the cellar door, which still gaped open in the earth like a mouth that refused to shut. That year, a group of men began clearing the land, planning to salvage the wood and stone. They carried picks and shovels into the cellar, expecting only rot and mold. Instead, they found the remnants of a design too patient to decay. The jars were buried beneath loose boards at the back of the cellar, stacked carefully in a wooden crate, each sealed with wax. There were more than a dozen of them, their glass cloudy with age. When the men pried the crate open and lifted the first jar to the light, they froze. Inside floated something unmistakable, the small, pale heart of a child suspended in brine that had darkened to the color of smoke. Another jar held the same, and another. Each bore a paper label, ink faded but still legible, marked with initials. TK for Thomas Keaton. EK for Elsie, SK for Samuel. One by one, the names matched the children who had vanished before their 9th year. The men recoiled, some swearing and stumbling back toward the stairs. Yet one remained, lantern trembling in his grip, staring at the tiny organs pressed against glass. They were not shriveled or rotten, but preserved, as though Elias and Clara had wanted them to last. The thought struck everyone at once. These jars were not trophies taken in madness. They were records, kept with the same precision as Elias's ledgers and Clara's journals. The Keaton children had been dismantled, reduced to what their parents called vessels, and stored in silence beneath the floor. When word reached town, investigators descended on the cellar, lanterns blazing, notebooks ready. They cataloged each jar, lifting them carefully from the crate and setting them in rows on a table. It looked less like a crime scene than a laboratory. The remains lined up as if part of an experiment long abandoned. Some jars held more than hearts. One contained a small cluster of teeth sharpened into points. Another held fragments of skin with lines carved into them, the grooves faint but still visible. A third jar contained nothing but cloudy water and strands of hair. Every piece confirmed the pattern that neighbors had whispered for decades. The Keatons had not lost their children to illness or accident. They had kept them here, piece by piece, embalmed in brine. What horrified investigators most was not just the contents, but the care. The jars were sealed with wax to keep them airtight. The labels were written in Clara's neat hand, each letter exact, each stroke deliberate. These were not the markings of hysteria. They were the deliberate acts of a woman who believed preservation was devotion, who believed silence could be bottled and stored. Elias's role was unmistakable in the etchings and sharpened teeth, but Clara's was in the jars themselves. In the steady, methodical way the remains had been collected and catalogued. The cellar became a chamber of proof, but it also deepened the mystery. Why hearts? Why preserve them when the rest of the body was discarded? Some believed Elias thought the heart was the truest vessel, the final measure of endurance. Others believed Clara could not let go, that she kept the hearts as relics to worship in secret. Whatever the reason, the jars revealed a truth darker than any rumor, that the Keatons had transformed their own children into specimens, not only to test them, but to keep them even after death. The men who carried the jars from the cellar never spoke of it again without shuddering. They said the brine inside seemed to ripple when held close to the lantern, as though something still shifted beneath the glass. The organs had been dead for decades, yet the air of the cellar clung with the heaviness of presence, as if the silence of the Keaton children had not ended with death, but had been sealed and preserved with them. And when the last jar was lifted from the crate, the floor beneath groaned, as if the house itself resisted giving up its final secret. Margaret Keaton was the last of the children, the youngest vessel in a house already emptied by silence. In the winter of 1883, when the snow pressed heavy against the roof and the fields lay frozen, the townsfolk heard that she, too, had died. But unlike the others, she was not simply whispered away with excuses of fever or accident. She was shown, displayed as though Elias and Clara wished her passing to serve as proof of something greater. When neighbors entered the parlor, they found Margaret laid out on the wooden floor, dressed in her Sunday clothes, though it was not Sunday. Her hair was combed flat and parted neatly, her small shoes polished, her hands folded across her chest. But it was her face that froze those who saw her. It had been painted white, not with powder, but with something thicker, an uneven mask that dulled her features and turned her skin waxen. Her eyelids had been sewn shut with dark thread, the stitches coarse and deliberate, puckering the skin into unnatural lines. She did not look asleep. She looked bound, as though even death was not permitted its natural expression. Clara stood beside her, murmuring that Margaret had undergone a holy passing. Elias, standing stiff at the mantel, added that the vessel had completed its purpose. Their tones were calm, matter-of-fact, as though they had not lost a daughter but completed a ritual. The undertaker, summoned to prepare the body, refused to touch her. He backed away with his hands shaking, muttering that no Christian burial could be offered to what had been done. For the first time, the town felt a chill stronger than rumor. They had always suspected the Keatons hid something behind their shutters. Now they had seen it laid bare, dressed like ceremony, presented like sacrifice. No burial was recorded for Margaret. Some claimed she was taken from the parlor in the night and carried to the cellar. Others said Elias buried her himself beneath the frozen orchard. But no grave was ever marked, no name carved into stone. What lingered was the image of her white-painted face, her sewn eyelids, the calm voices of her parents insisting it was holy. It was not grief, it was doctrine performed with a steadiness that left no room for mourning. With Margaret's silence, the Keaton line ended. Yet the house did not loosen its hold. It remained, shutters drawn, cellar sealed, as if waiting for its secrets to ripen beneath the soil. By the time the neighbors found their courage to act, it was already too late. Margaret's display on the parlor floor had broken the spell of silence that bound the town for years. Families who had turned away their eyes now signed their names on petitions, demanding an inquiry into what had happened in the Keaton house. Rumors of the jars, the instruments, the shoes tied with twine, all were spoken aloud at last, no longer whispered at fences but carried to the sheriff's desk. The community at last wanted justice for the Keaton children. But when officials prepared to summon Elias and Clara, they found the farmhouse already in mourning. Both parents were dead, struck down within days of each other. The cause was never agreed upon. Some said they succumbed to illness, their bodies weakened by years of their own strange diets and rituals. Others claimed poison, pointing to Clara's trembling hands in her final weeks, her face yellowed as if drained from within. A few went further, saying it was divine retribution, that no mortal court would have judged them, so judgment had come by a higher hand. Their sudden deaths left the petitions meaningless. Without witnesses to answer, without confessions to record, the case faltered before it could begin. Officials described the Keaton story in tidy words: family tragedy. The phrase appeared in county ledgers, reducing years of ritual cruelty into the shape of accident and sorrow. No charges were filed, no trials were held. The children who had never lived to see their 9th birthdays were denied justice in death as they had been denied protection in life. Neighbors muttered that the timing was too neat, that Elias and Clara had chosen their own exit once discovery loomed. Some swore they had seen Elias carry small vials from the cellar in his final days, the kind that could hold mixtures no one else dared taste. Others said Clara herself had brewed their end, at last turning her jars inward, binding their silence alongside the children's. Whatever the truth, the fact remained. The parents who had orchestrated the slow undoing of 6 young lives left this world untouched by the law. The farmhouse stood empty after their deaths, windows dark, doors locked but never boarded. Locals avoided its path, crossing fields to steer clear of the road that ran past it. They said at night the parlor window glowed faintly, though no lamp burned inside. The story of the Keatons became less a case than a curse, an example told to warn children of silence, of secrets, of the danger of houses where neighbors never ask questions. And so, the official record closed. The deaths of the Keaton children, their vanished bodies, their altered remains, their jars of preserved hearts, were all folded into the words, family tragedy. Justice, once demanded, dissolved into paperwork and silence. The trial that might have revealed the depth of their cruelty never came, and the farm itself became the only witness that remained. A house rotting into the soil, heavy with secrets no court would ever hear. The Keaton farmhouse rotted into silence, but its shadow stretched far beyond the cedar grove. In Madison, legislators began to murmur about the deaths that had unsettled the county. The Keaton name was never written into debate, never spoken in public record. Yet everyone in the chamber understood what case hung behind their words. Officials could not explain why 6 children in one family never lived past 9 years. They could not explain the jars in the cellar, the sewn eyelids, the missing graves. But they could change the rules that had allowed such horrors to pass without scrutiny. In the mid-1880s, Wisconsin quietly drafted new laws for the protection of children. They were written not in the language of grief, but in the tone of bureaucracy. Every death must be recorded with proper cause. Every burial must be accompanied by official notice. Every doctor who failed to provide a written account of an illness would face penalties. Midwives and undertakers were ordered to keep ledgers, and county clerks were required to store them in permanent archives. Autopsies, once rare, became mandated for unexplained child deaths. Inspectors were authorized to enter private homes when conditions of neglect or concealment were suspected. The measures passed without fanfare, framed as progress in public health, but those who signed them into law carried the Keaton story like a weight in their pockets. One legislator, years later, admitted in a private letter that he had voted yes because he remembered seeing Margaret Keaton's face painted white, her eyelids sewn with black thread. Another confessed that he feared every rural household might carry the same silence, that without oversight, more children would vanish into the soil uncounted. The Keaton case never reached court, but it shaped the law in ways that courts alone never could. It reminded officials that evil could hide not in strangers but in parents, not in the streets but in the hearth. It taught them that families could become prisons, that devotion could be a mask for ritual, that silence could kill as surely as a blade. And though the statutes avoided names and avoided scandal, every word was soaked in the memory of a farmhouse where no questions were asked until it was too late. The new laws did not bring the Keaton children back, nor did they erase the jars in the cellar or the instruments rusting beneath the stairs. But they built a framework that future generations would lean upon. They made neglect a matter of record, made secrecy harder to sustain, and forced the state itself to keep watch where neighbors had failed. History does not always remember why laws change, only that they do. But in Wisconsin's archives, beneath the dry ink and folded parchment, lies the ghost of a family erased by its own rituals. The Keatons were buried without trial, but their silence rewrote the rules of the living. The Keaton story never ended with a trial, nor with a confession, nor even with a proper burial for the children who were lost. It ended with silence. The same silence that had ruled the farmhouse in life. No verdict was spoken, no grave bore their names, and yet in that absence the shape of their suffering pressed itself into history. For decades afterward, Wisconsin lawmakers and local families alike carried the memory of what was allowed to unfold in plain sight, behind closed shutters disguised as ordinary devotion. The horror of the Keaton family was not only in what Elias and Clara did, but in how easily the world around them explained it away. Illness, accident, misfortune. These words were offered like shields, covering over the truth that children were vanishing one after another in the same house, under the same care. The neighbors did not ignore the signs because they were blind. They ignored them because silence was easier than accusation, because to accuse meant tearing at the fabric of community itself. And so evil thrived, not in shadow but in broad daylight, in pews and shared meals, in the soft nods of reassurance that everything was fine. When investigators later uncovered jars in the cellar, instruments beneath the stairs, and journals written in Clara's steady hand, the truth could no longer be denied. But by then, the parents were gone, carried away by illness or poison, leaving only artifacts of cruelty behind. Justice had no voice left to answer. The Keatons never stood in court, never faced punishment, never heard their crimes read aloud. Their story ended not with accountability but with a house that rotted into the soil while the state quietly reshaped its laws to keep such silence from settling again. The legacy of the Keatons is not found in names carved on stone, but in the rules that followed. The requirement of autopsies, the demand for death records, the power granted to inspect homes that hid too much. These laws bore no dedication, yet they carried within them the shadow of 6 children who never reached 9 years old. The state moved forward, but it was their absence that forced its hand. And so the film closes not with answers, but with reflection. Evil rarely appears monstrous at first glance. It hides in plain daylight, disguised as care, wrapped in the routines of family life, softened by hymns and handshakes. What society missed in Cedar Grove was not the screams, but the silence of children too afraid to speak, the silence of neighbors unwilling to ask, the silence of a community that chose comfort over confrontation. The Keatons were never held accountable, but their silence was not wasted. It reshaped how a state guarded its children. It whispered forward into laws, into oversight, into vigilance. The haunting question that remains is whether we have truly learned or whether silence still carries more weight than truth. What do you think? Could this happen again?